Morning, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and it's great to be back on campus. As Jonathan was saying, I have been an academic here at the psychology department at Mount Royal back in 2008 when I was at MRC. And so I started off teaching human development and social psychology. And I was asked if I was interested to teach a course called the Psychology of Aging at the UC and at Mount Royal. So the two profs who were teaching it were retiring. I was 28 at that time. And so, of course, as anything new, I said, sure. And coming from New Zealand, where the accent's from, I had a lot of experience in my family. We come from a culture where we are multi-generational in our household. And so I had my grandparents living with us, and of course my parents as well. And so I thought, well, I've been around old people enough, so I think I can do this. That was way back when there wasn't really a lot of talk about growing old and aging in our society. And it was part of a human development course. So I taught that course at the USC for 10 years and here at Mount Royal for 13 and a half years, right until last year when I decided to take all that knowledge and experience outside of the university walls, where I thought it would probably be best needed, which was right. So this course that had given me an opportunity to talk to students about aging and an aging society, I learned a great deal out of it, but also I came to the realization that as a third-year course, and it was fourth year at the UC, it taught social and clinical topics around aging. Not many of my students were really interested in working with older people. So my students who would be attending the course were predominantly psychology majors because it was a 300 and 400 level course. I also had nursing students and social work students as well, in addition to other students who were just interested in this whole thing around aging. So when I asked my students on day one why they're here, which is how I start off the course, what are you doing here? Who forced you to enroll? A lot of them actually just said, you're really just here for personal reasons. We're just really interested. Now, show of hands, I say. How many of you here are wanting to, thinking of, it's a Psychology of Aging course, work with older people? At Mount Royal, where I'd have 35 students enrolled, which is our max in this course, I'd be lucky if I get 3 hands up. And at the USC, where I would have 120 students enrolled, I'd be lucky if I get about 8 or 10. And that didn't actually change throughout the decade plus of years of me teaching this course. So after teaching it for that many semesters and years, it still baffled me that they're enrolled in a course called the Psychology of Aging. They are potential future healthcare professionals where they're either geriatrics or gerontology, and not many of them are actually keen on even working with older people. It stopped surprising me, I think, after a few semesters, but I'd still ask the question, who here is interested? What are your hopes for acquiring this knowledge, and how are you going to use it in the future? So of course, when Jocelyn and I had a chat about what's going on at the university and in our society last year, I was super excited and very honored to be asked to come and talk about my experience teaching a course called the Psychology of Aging, but also to give you a lot of examples out of the decade of teaching this course as well. I'm actually going to also start off, of course, I didn't have a fancy title as one would have, because when Justin and I were having a conversation about having an age-inclusive or age-friendly approach to the university, which we don't have yet, I said, well, first of all, we have to really talk about aging and ageism in our society, as well as the university as well. But I'll start off with a story. Ironically, this is how the universe works sometimes. A couple of weeks ago, I was dropping off my youngest, Miss 7, let's call her, to her gym, and we usually take the same route every week. We have to go through the university or by the university. And at the traffic light, we were stopped, and she just looked out of the window, and I could see her in the mirror, and she just looked at the people going into the university and leaving Mount Royal University, and she said, there are a lot of teenagers going in there. And in her mind, of course, younger people, younger adults look like teenagers. And it just caught me off guard, and I said, yeah, but, older people, older adults can also go in there too. And she's like, yeah, they're not dressed like older adults though. They're all younger people. So I said, well, older people can and are at university, either working or studying. And she said, how do they learn their lessons? How do they remember? So it struck me that here I am talking about aging and ageism after leaving university and being called by a lot of not-for-profit agencies to talk about this. And my own child was questioning whether or not older people have the intellectual capability to actually remember and learn lessons. And so it really, really brought into light at such a young age, our society has instilled in our children that older people aren't as good or of value or can continue to be of value and learn throughout their human lifespan. And I thought, I'm just going to write this down because I'm going to mention it in a few weeks. So here I am mentioning this. So where I stand in terms of this conversation, not only am I an academic, or I was an academic, I'm currently also an advisor. I'm an advisor for the Ministry of Seniors and Housing for Minister Josephine Pond. I am on her Seniors Committee Advisory Group, and I'm also a board member on the Canadian Network for Prevention of Elder Abuse. I also conduct awareness and education workshops around aging and dementia in Arabic, which is another language that I also speak. So I found that having conversations with people about aging is very important, but there's more to it than just having conversations. It's really about how we can find ways to adjust and support people as well. So the conversation hopefully will go around aging, I guess, and growing old, but also I'll give you a few examples really of things that I used to do when I was teaching this course at the university. So as somebody who always wanted to make the course more relevant, when the pandemic hit a couple of years ago initially, and we all went online, and we were hearing in the news the impact of the pandemic on long-term care facilities, my students were really concerned about what was happening around them. Many of them had grandparents, of course, and aging parents as well. And so they were really more interested in knowing what is this pandemic about and why does it seem like it's affecting older people the most? Now, it didn't help that we also had some tweets by some politicians that were very ageist as well, which I, of course, used in my classes too as examples. But also I used the military report that came out in Ontario and Quebec about the situation in long-term care there as well, to drive the point that as a nation, with a growing aging population, it should not come as a surprise that we have older people or more older adults, and it should not come as a surprise or catch us off guard that we need to be well equipped to support them. But apparently we were. And so students were really interested, and so I created, out of whatever I could get my hands on back then, a whole lesson plan called Aging in the Time of COVID-19. And so here I am talking about quality of life, successful aging, and how older adults thrive when there are social connections, but the pandemic is isolating older adults. We're telling people not to visit family members or grandparents. And so students are going, well, now what? Now what's happening to their quality of life? Now what's happening to how they are aging and how they're growing older? And so we talked about it. And I wish I knew and I had met both of you before I stopped teaching, because I would have loved to invite Elder Roy and also Sharon, of course, to my classes. I was very keen on inviting people to come as guest speakers. We also had guest speakers come in from the Mustard Seed, from the Kirby Senior Center, from the Drop-In Center. I'd invite them into my classes to talk about the average life expectancy of homeless people, for example, which, if you don't know, is 52, which is about 30 years shorter than the average life expectancy of Canadians. So it's just things like that my students, who even though they had no interest in working with older people, I was trying to convince them that they need to. And I said, hey, if you want to be hired, that's probably an area that's going to be needing a lot of individuals like yourselves. But it was more than that. I wanted to show them that we're doing it wrong. We're doing how we view aging and how we're fearing aging, as well as us being a death-fearing society, of course, and how we're not really valuing older people. We're doing it wrong, and we really need to kind of change that perspective. And my hope was, if I changed their personal perspective, at some point they also think about working with older people as well. So my initial start of any conversation in my classes is, of course, to tell them that they're all ageist, which to an extent is probably true. We are all ageist in some way, in some form. Even someone like myself, who keeps on reiterating that we shouldn't be ageist, I find I catch myself sometimes probably thinking or saying something that is not appropriate. So the World Health Organization, in 2006, and so we're talking about a long, long time ago, technically, started off this initiative on age-friendly communities, realizing that globally we're seeing a rise in older people, and so we need to do something about that. So, and this is where the initiative here in Canada and various parts of the country, of the globe, I should say, were participating in this project about finding out what it is that countries need in order to be prepared for a growing aging population, what kind of supports and resources are needed. And so they piloted a few projects globally, of course, and Canada was one of those countries as well, where they piloted around various cities in the country. Every second person in the world is believed to hold ageist attitudes, and we know from research that ageism leads to poorer quality of life, poorer access to social supports, health supports, emotional and mental health supports, etc. But I think one of the biggest problems, as my youngest child had shown, is that we start to believe from a young age that we are no good and no value later on as we grow older. And so we actually do have, for some people, that personal ageism as well, in which we think, or we assume and expect, that as we grow old, we shouldn't be of value or of worth, or I shouldn't expect people to think of me as someone of value and of worth. And what that does is it decreases a person's confidence and self-esteem. And another really cool bit of research or a finding that I would talk to my students about is people, this is science, people who have a more positive perspective of aging have a chance of about 7.5 years of living longer than those who have a more negative view and perspective of aging. So just the way that we think about aging and growing older can actually help us live longer. And not thinking about it in a positive way actually decreases our average life expectancy or the life expectancy of a person. And so just that shift in perspective, if we can help people with that, it can actually help them live longer if that's what they want. Another funny, interesting fact I ask my students who are younger adults is how many of you want to live to be a century old or 100? Not many of them want to. And I think that also, to some extent, can exemplifies they don't really have high hopes about growing old anyway. Why should I live to be 100? What's there to look forward to, right? And so not many of them actually want to be 100. So, I'm going to whiz through some of the stuff that I would speak to my students about, because I'm pretty sure you're all quite able to do this as well. But when I start my class, first and foremost, I actually ask them about their own biases and stereotypes. And so and the reason behind that is my students are psychology majors, and some of them are social work students, and some of them are nurses. And so for me, it is so important to talk about what are the stereotypes and biases that we carry with us, because again, those stereotypes and biases could, in some way, in some form, seep through your healthcare plan with your client or your patient, or the way that you treat them, or the way that you talk with them. You know, assuming that you're 81, not knowing that you have hearing aids, will I speak a bit louder and start shouting? Or will I start speaking very slowly? You know, and part of the course, we talk about elder speak and infantilization as well. And yeah, I know my students have an idea about what this is, but I don't think they really have an idea of how hugely detrimental it is, right? And some of these questions are the questions that I ask my students in class. I start off with saying, when I say senior citizen, what is the first thing that comes to mind? And I get them to run to the whiteboard and write it down, just so they're thinking about it. And I do see some hesitation, because I know they know it's not the right thing to think about, right? But I say, you know, we're here to talk about this. It's a safe place. We create it as a safe place. We're here to discuss and put all of these stereotypes and biases on the table so we can talk about them and we can hash through them. And I have grumpy, slow, stuck in their old ways. I have a whole lot. The majority of them will be negative, of course, and some will be positive. But I think even the positives sometimes are a bit problematic, because then you put older adults sometimes on this pedestal, like, this is my personal opinion, like the 70 over 70, for example. I'm not a huge fan of those things, and that's because it creates these high expectations that at 70, I should be bungee jumping and skydiving, for example. And that's not realistic for many people, right? But when we say, oh, look at all these accomplishments of these 70 people over 70, I'm not there yet, but I can imagine my parents, for example, feeling a bit inadequate if they haven't accomplished those things. So we also do have some positive stereotypes that can be a bit problematic, as well as the negative ones. So why do you think we should study aging? I love that question. the most, because I want to know what their opinions are. What are our society's attitudes towards older adults? What comes to mind when I say senior or senior citizen? And then we talk about the visible and invisible signs of aging, because we do talk about the physical changes associated with aging. I really do try and make this course fun, or as interactive and as relevant and new as possible, because a lot of my students, and we do a reflective assignment at the beginning of the course, and a reflective assignment at the end of the course. What are your expectations? What are the thoughts that you have about this course called The Psychology of Aging and Aging? And then at the end, after a good few months together, we've warmed up, they do another reflective assignment. What have you gained? What are you taking with you? How have your thoughts evolved? And I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but I will. It is a very successful course, and I'm hoping it continues to run in the department. It was always fully booked in terms of enrollment. I always had a wait list on the course. It ran through the major big semesters here in the fall and the winter. And almost all of my students felt that they gained more after leaving the course about this whole idea of aging. And some of them, lucky enough, some of them actually went on to volunteer their times at some of the not-for-profit agencies that would come as guest speakers as well, which was really amazing to hear. And I had actually a couple of students pre-pandemic who continued to volunteer at the Curtin Senior Centre for many years after they graduated from Mount Royal. And for me, that's it, I made it, in my opinion. It's great to have a Mount Royal student be part of this great initiative. So these are some of the things that I ask my students, and then we start talking about this. I attended a webinar just last week, and it was in the United States. So this whole ageism movement is really big in the US right now, especially with the number of people resigning, or I don't want to call it that, great resignation, and people trying to figure out how they could readjust or pivot career-wise, etc. The webinar that I attended last week they had a guest speaker from a university in one of the states. Sorry, I can't remember it right now. And it was a person from the nursing department, and she stated that 70 to 75% of their nursing students had no contact with older adults, aside from their own grandparents if they were lucky enough to have that. 70 to 75%. I mean, I wrote that percentage down because I'm thinking, what? How could they not have? But then again, I wasn't really surprised, because when I asked my students here at Mount Royal, what is your level of contact with older people? The majority of them also just said, grandparents. If they are lucky to have any grandparents, either alive or living in the same city or province as they were. So a lot of the younger adults at university are gradually actually not having much contact with older people. So it makes sense that they don't really want to work with older adults, because even when they do have contact, it depends on the role model, the examples that they have in contact with. It might not have been the best. Their grandparents might not have been the most interactive grandparents, let's say. But also it depends on how their grandparents are experiencing aging and growing older, and what things come out of their mouths when they talk about growing older and aging. So those are some really interesting examples and realizations. And again, another example, I do not expect you to look through all of this, but for the fun of it, again, as I mentioned, I try to make this as engaging as possible. And I think it's because their expectations are, you're going to tell us about all the things that are going to go downhill from here, aren't you? All the things that are not going to work. And I said, well, part of that is right. There are a lot of things that are not going to function as well as they did before, and that's the reality of it. I think it's very important for us not to paint a very unrealistic picture of growing older. I think we should be very realistic, but also it's not all bleak either at the same time. My dad retired at the age of 72, and he retired unwillingly. He was an academic, an engineer. All he knew was engineering and teaching at the university, and he was very grumpy when he retired. Another example of how sometimes our older adults weren't even prepared. What am I going to do after I retire? And so many older adults right now want to go back into a new career, maybe reinvent themselves all over again, and that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing this movement of people who are not wanting to retire because I'm still of worth and I'm still of value. But what am I going to do in a society that's very ageist and thinks that I'm not of worth and of value anymore? What we did with my dad, for example, is that he wanted to mentor engineering students, and so we registered him, and now he's mentoring engineering students 3 times a day, an hour a week, and so, an hour a day, so 3 hours a week. He's absolutely loving it. And so he feels like he's still got something that people are really wanting. He feels of worth and of value. And that, throughout this course, was what I was trying to tell my students, is that lifelong learners, in Arabic, where in my culture, we talk about learning from the cradle to the grave. And it's embedded in our culture. And I told my students that that's what life learning is about. Learning from the cradle to the grave. Learning to the point where you think, well, I don't really want to learn anymore. And that could be at 80, it could be at 60, it could be at 100, regardless, right? So we do some true and falses as well to combat some of those stereotypes that the students have. And you would be surprised, or probably not, because you're all in that profession. They have a lot of stereotypes, students do, at least the younger ones. Many of them think of older adults as asexual, by the way. Many of them think that after a particular age, you just stop doing it. And I point out the fact that perhaps their parents and grandparents are still very sexually active. Some of them cringe at that point. That's a big problem, I think, in my opinion. It's a problem when we think that older adults don't need intimacy, regardless of what that intimacy looks like. So I think you and your friends were experiencing intimacy at a different level. It doesn't have to be sexual intercourse. It could be whatever it is that you want it to be. But many younger adults think that older adults are asexual. Many of them actually think that, and this is what really baffles me. And it baffled me as well because I was doing a geriatric certificate actually at one point, and it also had this true or false question, which caught me off guard. Many of them actually think that clinical depression is a normal part of aging, and dementia is a normal experience that we would all go through. And so they have a lot of problematic stereotypes that here I was trying to pull them apart, going, why do we think that, and how do we address that? And that's why it was a very busy course. It was a very, very interactive course as well. And I really, really, truly believe it's a very important course to continue in any department, I think, because I did have students from child studies, and I did have law students, and I also had students from the business schools as well coming in. And the reality is, I told students this, no matter what professional career you end up being in, you must at some point interact with an older person. Whether or not you like it, you will have to interact with them as a client, as a patient, as a family member, as a neighbor, as a friend. And it's like, you really need need to think about how you think about older people and aging as well. And because I'm an academic, I would throw around some statistics. And they really enjoyed this, of course. So we talked about terminology. So gerontophobia is the fear or dislike of older people. Gerostophobia is actually fear of aging. So we really actually have words for that now, where we fear aging and we also are afraid of older people. And that's actually a thing. And then, of course, the whole idea of the positive perception of aging could actually help you live about 7.5 years longer than those with negative perception of aging. And a 2022 article that came out, February 2022, because I'm on the ministry, I like to also pull out research for the ministry. The article actually stated that ageism and elder abuse are two sides of the same coin. So this 2022 article that came out talked about how we will see a rise in elder abuse as a result of us also being an ageist society, where we then start to almost be desensitized to signs of elder abuse because we assume it's normal or it's a normal part of a society that has older people. Interestingly enough, they also talk about how, from a cultural perspective, signs of elder abuse can be very unique, where in some cultures, raising your voice or using disrespectful words is actually considered elder abuse in some cultures. So it's a very important topic to talk about, I guess, and address. And this is from Statistics Canada. So we know now that we have more 65-year-olds for the first time in our Canadian history than those who are 0 to 14, which are usually when we then will see them enter the workforce after 14 plus. And so we will and actually do have a workforce shortage as well at the same time. But it's not just any workforce shortage, it's also a workforce shortage in those who have experience and expertise and a wealth of knowledge, which is why it is very important to think about how can we support older adults who actually want to go back into a career or reinvent and recreate a new career to help a workforce that is actually going to be in desperate need of the nurses, the physiotherapists, the psychologists, the counselors, and the social workers, etc. And Alberta, this is where I'm trying to hopefully also drive this need for us to address it. Although we're considered the youngest province, people don't usually come to Alberta to stay and live. They usually historically came to work and then they would go back to other provinces where the majority of our aging population would be in, of course, the maritime area and also parts of British Columbia. That's where we see the oldest age category groups. Alberta actually is growing in terms of its aging populations as well. It's the fastest growing province in the number of older people. And predominantly, we're seeing the fastest growing in the category of immigrant older people. So we're having immigrants come to Alberta to work, but we're having them stay here as well. And so in turn, they will be the aging population or the older adults as well. So we're not only seeing a growing older population, we're seeing a growing ethnically diverse older population in our province as well. And we are the fastest growing province in terms of those who are over the age of 65. So here we are talking about growing old, and as I mentioned to Jocelyn, well, I can't talk about aging and being inclusive. We don't talk about what it is that actually prevents us from being inclusive, and that is ageism. So ageism isn't actually a new term. It was termed by Robert Butler in 1969. So way back then, this was something that we realized and saw. And so it's basically a form of systematic discrimination and stereotyping and prejudice. So there's three components to ageism. The way that we think about older people, the way that we feel about older people, and the way that we behave towards older people. So we can be ageist in those three components. Sometimes we outwardly show them, and sometimes we know it's inappropriate, so we hide them, or we think ageist thoughts. And that's why I said we're sort of all ageist in some way, in some form. And when it comes to ageism, I ask my students, what is the first thing that comes to mind when you think about older person or a senior citizen, for example? And then I ask some of my students, have you heard a family member, for example, say, back in my time, this is how things were. And how did you feel about that? Our views about older adulthood or about aging and growing older has a definite impact, as I mentioned with my own child, on how they perceive this whole normal lifespan stage. We are all going to age. It's almost like we are now, this is how I tell students, this is how I say it. If you're ageist right now, you're basically ageist towards your future self, by the way. Because your future self is an older person. And so you want to fix that, you want to address that now, before you grow older too. The majority of students who attend a psychology of aging course that I did had negative views about growing older. The majority of them actually had predominantly this idea that it was just this miserable time of our human lifespan. And here I was, not of that age category yet, but trying to convince them to think otherwise. And so we actually also did a life history project assignment, which is the bulk of the course, in which they had to befriend an older person, a neighbor or a family member, and write about their life history and get the older person to talk about who they were as children, who they were as a younger person, who they are now, and how that evolved to being the person that they were. And again, I want to say all students benefited from that project. Many of them actually bonded with that person. Some of them were grandparents, and with their consent, they audio or videotape this, and they said, if we have children and they will get to see my own grandparents, then at least I've got this thing here where I can hear my grandparents again and listen to their story. And I have to say, many of them were surprised to hear some of their experiences, and they bonded over that. And oh, these are the awesome things that my grandparents went through that I never knew they experienced because they didn't talk about it. And I said, well, probably because you never asked them about it. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to whiz by this because I've already talked about the stereotype. So ageism in itself is a form of discrimination, as I mentioned. We actually can be ageist towards younger people. So when we assume all adolescents are troublemakers, for example, that is actually ageist. I did have somebody on one of the podcasts, live webinars that I was invited to. I had a person comment and say, well, you're not old yet, what are you going to teach us about growing old? Which is ageist as well. And so I've experienced ageism, my dad experienced ageism. I don't want to assume, but we might have examples, personal examples here of ageism as well. So ageism can impact anybody. But what we're seeing is it has the biggest impact in that detrimental negative way for those who are over the age of, in fact, 48 and plus. So it starts actually quite young. So those who are aged 48 start to experience ageism from that and onwards, unfortunately. So ageism actually occurs in our society due to a variety of reasons, of course. One of the main reasons in Western society, because we're age-fearing, we other older adults. So it's that whole social psychology concept, us versus them. We are the young, and therefore we have a young category. You are the old, which is where you have the old category. And only recently did we actually start to go young, old, and we have the young old, old, or middle old, and then we have the old or the oldest old at that point. But initially, everyone who was 65 was lumped together, plus, in this old category, because we needed an us versus them in society. And in social psychology, whenever you create segregation like that, in any way and form, you're creating opportunities for disharmony and problems. The other reason why we have ageism is because our societal, I want to say, entanglement with this whole idea of being youthful. And being young means being able, being young means being beautiful, being young means being physically capable, and when you're older, you're none of that. And so this emphasis on plastic surgery, for example, which actually has increased in the older adult population as well, because people are being discriminated against in hiring processes if they have grey hair or if they have wrinkles. A lot of recruiters now are asking people over the age of 48 to not put the year of their graduation anymore. And any kind of work experience beyond 10 years or 15 years, just take that off, because it shows your age. And I've attended some of these webinars, and you can bet that I've been talking about not doing that. And in fact, my own dad was told at 52 that he was too old to be hired, and that because he has a PhD, he's overqualified, so maybe you should just take that PhD off. And he didn't. My dad worked as a taxi driver as a result for 5 years, until he became a dean at an overseas university that didn't discriminate against people who were older. Right, so when we talk about ageism, I have a very, very personal example, and I use my dad all the time when he loves it. He thinks he's very famous. And again, I think it's very problematic when I ask my students, what do you think of when you think about older person? They're like, oh, frail and in need of help. And then I think about my dad, I think about my grandparents who are very physically healthy and able for a very long time, and my dad is very physically able at 74. And I'm thinking, well, why do we have this assumption that older people are frail and elderly and they need to be pitied? So our society really needs to be educated more, I think, about what it is to be an older person. And we are age-fearing because of aging, and what happens in aging is an unknown experience. And that's why we're death-fearing, in fact, in Western society. So research has shown that this unknown, which is death, is something that we fear. So we have high death anxiety when people fear something that's unknown. And the pandemic is also another really good example of how we are anxious. We were anxious because of this unknown phenomenon that was happening. And we also have these fearful reactions of aging, because we assume that it's downhill and we're going to be cast aside and society wants nothing to do with us and we're just going to be lonely until we die. So I had a person who was a very young 20-year-old who said, I don't really want to live to be 85, I'm okay with about 70. And I said, why? She said, well, what's the point after that, really? I'm going to be hard of hearing, my partners are going to probably pass away, my friends are going to die, what's the point? And I'm thinking, well, we can get to that point. Can you and I have this conversation again and see how you really feel about growing older? And again, this whole idea of us being afraid of aging and how ageism affects us, I highlight to my students that ageism not only impacts us as a society, it impacts older people as well. Well, we have research that has actually shown that not only younger children, but also younger adults, but older adults as well, are hugely impacted by the way that we talk about aging and growing older, where they have a high rate of decline in mental health, they have accelerated decline in cognitive abilities, lower levels of self-esteem and self-worth. They don't really think there's any point in living anymore, so they have a lower sense and quality of life. And because there's this assumption that society thinks that you are no longer of value or of worth, it's just automatic for me just to lock myself up in my home or in my room because the world doesn't need me anymore. It's a world for the youthful people. And also, of course, economic discrimination. So there's that belief that as a person, an older adult is not of value or of worth. We, as a society, buy into that idea that older people are of not of worth or of value as well. And I think it's a really important thing to address, especially when we have younger adults and also probably older adults who want to go back into whatever field they're going back into with these ageist perspectives. Because when we talk about ageism, it's not just this internalized ageism that I've talked about, where we ourselves believe in these ageist views of our society, but it's also systematic as well. So in that webinar that I attended, what they did in this university in the States was they actually partnered all their nursing students with an older person throughout a semester. And they were engaging with them, not necessarily for a course, but it was just to have a buddy who was an older person. And they would share life experiences, personal experiences, maybe they'd help them out in an assignment of theirs, for example, or a project, but it was buddying with an older person. Because like I said, up to 75% of those students who were nursing students had little to no contact with an older person. So they figured, we really need to do something about this. We have a whole lot of older people around us in our community. We need to buddy these younger students with them. And I think it's especially important, not for the personal reasons, of course, as well as the interpersonal interactions and communications, but there's a high rate now, and we're seeing that, especially right now during the pandemic, of institutionalized ageism as well, especially in the healthcare system, where there are articles all around that are talking about our healthcare system being super ageist. And in fact, if you think about the pandemic, where there were situations, especially in the United States and also here in Canada as well, where if you were going to have an oxygen tank, for example, it was always preferred to give it to someone who had a higher chance of living and wasn't an older person as well. And I think that's just absolutely ridiculous, but it happened. And so, who are we to choose who gets to live? Who are we to choose who gets an oxygen tank or not? And these were some really difficult decisions that some of these healthcare professionals had to do, not because they wanted to, but in some situations, especially in the United States and in New York in particular, they had to, because there was no way out of that, but also because in some ways it was also regulated by some of the healthcare professionals in the hospitals. And so institutionalized ageism is where our policies and our actions do not benefit older people, but they only benefit the younger adults. And so when we think about ageism, it is intertwined with a whole lot of other things. you are more likely to experience ageism if you are a person who is a visible minority or a person who is of color or from Indigenous or First Nations backgrounds, but also if you are female or identify as female and you are an older person. So gendered ageism occurs where women are actually more likely to be affected by ageism. That's where ageism and sexism intersect. And ableism is also something that we hear about as well, where our policies predominantly cater for older adults who are able and not disabled or have some form of challenges, physical challenges that could potentially impact their quality of life as well. And so when we talk about ageism, it's intertwined with quite a lot of things. It's sometimes very complicated to pull it apart, but I think it's very important to at least start with these conversations first. I'm going to go through this very quickly, but this is one thing that I ask my students, how do we interact with older adults in society, at home, in our institutions? And a lot of them, give examples about older adults being ignored, elder speech, for example, being assumed asexual, being forced to retire, and mandatory retirement has been, we got rid of that back in 2008. However, there are ways that some companies are quite discriminatory in some discrete ways as well. But also the manifestations of ageism is where we treat older adults as incompetent. And there was this article, and forgive me, I can't remember the data that I clearly used it throughout my decade of teaching this course, that talked about the capabilities of older adults who enter, prior to entering long-term care and nursing homes and then after that. And so the article is basically stating that if an older adult has abilities, physical, cognitive, mental, emotional abilities up high here, and the assumption in that facility is their abilities should be right here, and we're going to do everything for you, we're going to bring everything to you, you don't need to leave the room, you don't need to get up, you don't need to be an independent living person. With time, and sometimes it takes as short of an amount of 3 months, the level of ability of that older person will start to drop and start to match the expectation in that facility. And so that's why I always reiterate this whole idea of we really need to fix this assumption that older people are incapable and we have to do everything for them. I did this presentation at Chartwell in Aurora in Toronto, and I talked about resilience. I had a gentleman who was 93 sitting at the front and very, very interactive. And he came up to me at the end of my talk and he said, "Young lady, you've made me want to live to be 100. And he said, "My dad lived to be 105 and I want to surpass that just to tell him that I did it." But he said, you talk about finding a purpose, and this is a really, really big thing that I'm really trying to drive. Living a meaningful life never stops. Just because you're 70 or 80 doesn't mean that you have to give up on living a purposeful, meaningful life. I see my dad continuing to want that. But he said, I don't want them to do things for me. I don't want them to bring me food to my room. Yes, it feels nice at first because it feels like a nice fancy hotel. But he said, but I want to do things for myself because it gives me a reason to, and he said, to jump out of bed very carefully. I just had to slip that there, right? And I absolutely love that conversation that I had with him. And I said to him, what gives you purpose? And so he lost his wife just a few months before that, and she was becoming visually impaired. And so what he does now is he reads books. So they created this book club to his visually impaired friends at that place. And so that's what gives him purpose. It could be something very small, but it gets him out of bed and he gets so excited about it. And in fact, he told me that he's going to start a newsletter as well. And so there are these things that we can do to help students realize that it's not all bleak and downhill from here. I don't have a lot of time, I know that, but this is one really important thing that I just wanted to also mention, just as I'm going to talk quickly about age-friendly universities, because I really think this is a cool initiative that we should start here at Mount Royal. Intergenerational contact is becoming a new thing right now, and I think it's becoming more and more impactful because new research is coming out. And I don't know why it's new research, because I come from a multi-generational household, and so we could see that in our family. But we're finding that when we bring younger people and older people together, magic can happen. And it could be something as small as, and they're doing all of this in Europe, of course, because it's really fancy in Europe. They're creating preschools or daycares, and even sometimes they have elementary students, and in some places they have high school students come into wherever older people congregate. It could be a community, it could be an assisted living, for example, and they meet together and they talk over coffee, or they help them with crafts in the case of the younger kids, for example. They do story time with them, for example. And some of these older adults aren't grandparents due to not having grandkids around or not having them physically with them. And so what they find is the quality of life and that purpose and meaning after they do these assessments pre and post increase substantially with this intergenerational interaction. And I think it's an awesome thing to have. And I know we have a Mount Royal preschool / daycare here, and I think it'd be really, really good for that to be implemented in some way, in some form here. So there's this cool global initiative that I'm really excited about. And this is something that I think Mount Royal University will be so awesome at doing, in my opinion. And especially that the UC is already there, so I think we should catch up to that. So in 2012, the City of Dublin, the University of City of Dublin, started off this initiative called Age-Friendly Universities, coming out from this 2006 WHO Age-Friendly Communities. They're realizing that older adults want to come back to educate themselves, maybe finish a degree that they didn't finish, or start a degree that they weren't able to do, but also because of this lack of understanding of growing old and aging in our older adult population. And so they created this initiative in which it is a global network. And the government of Canada is into this whole age-friendly community thing. So when we talk about age-friendly inclusive communities, when policies and services and structures are designed to help older adults be and continue to be active in our community and enjoy living safely and also enjoying good health as well. But we also find that an age-inclusive or positive or diverse environment is actually manufactured out of this sense of purpose and belonging and growth and learning as well. So when we say age-friendly, and I don't really like the word friendly because you immediately think older adults only, I'd rather call it age-diverse or age-inclusive. When we think about age-inclusive communities or establishments, we think about an establishment that helps you continue to grow, that helps you to continue to learn as that lifelong learner from the cradle to the grave. But it also taps into that purpose as well. And you feel you belong there as well. So when we look at DEI initiatives, a research that currently came out in the United States found out that only 8% of DEI initiatives in the United States actually address ageism. Only 8%, despite the fact that we are going to see an increasingly aging population. And so this is how, when we plan an age-inclusive environment or community, this is what we have to think about. Does this place provide that sense of purpose? Does it provide that sense of belonging? Does proposed by the AFU, the Age-Friendly University Global Network. There are more than 90 universities that are part of this network. About 8 of them only are Canadian ones. The University of Manitoba was the first university in Canada to join this network in 2015. U of C, I believe, joined maybe in 2018 or 2019, something like that. So we really have some catching up to do. But this is what the research is saying. What benefits us as a society is that we are first and foremost embracing the fact that we are diverse in our age populations and our groups. But we're also ensuring that that continuous cycle of skills and expertise and knowledge is being fed back into our society and our community. So economically, we need to be age inclusive. Barbara Beskind is an innovator, and at the age of 85, she said, "I've landed my dream job." Barbara Beskind was an innovator and an educator throughout her life, continuously wanting to thrive. She joined a high-tech California-based organization that actually does fancy tech for older people. And she thought, there are all younger people working in this tech company. They know nothing about the needs of older people. And so she joined them, and she still actually is part of that. Every now and then they come and consult her. So an example of this whole age diversity and age inclusiveness, older people are the innovators. They're part of this whole, how can we make our community more age inclusive? And I think it's a really good business. And someone who was a gerontologist, I won't mention the name, said, older adults are really good business, too, because you'll have people coming in and paying you as well at the same time, so they can be really good clients too. Again, I don't expect you to read this, but I just wanted to highlight that to be age inclusive and diverse as a community, as a university, you're actually benefiting everybody. There has to be a buy-in though, a buy-in from faculty, from administrators, from the students as well as the staff, but also from the donors and from the alumni who are leaving or don't continuously donating to the university. So these are the universities. There are 8 universities in Canada. As I mentioned, Manitoba was the first to join. MRU can become part of this international group of colleges and universities. It is a global network, so universities all around the world. But I want to say about 80% of them are in the United States. So 80% of this network is actually American, and then the rest are around the world. The Ivy League universities in the States aren't part of this network, interestingly enough. And I asked somebody who was part of this network why, and they said they do their own thing. That's basically the comment that I got. I'm not going to give you this, but how to promote this in age inclusivity. First of all, of course, I think we have more courses that are accessible to older adults, first of all. Provide certifications to enhance their skills that they already have. Use age-positive and inclusive language and communication, and that way you use it in your classrooms and the students pick it up and they use it in their profession as well. I avoid using seniors. I avoid using elders. I believe elders are designated for a particular group of people. It's a sacred word, and so I usually use older adults or older people. Use strength-based language. I think it's very important to not say, for example, he or she suffers from dementia, where you're putting the problem before the person, because it's a person first and then it's a challenge. They are diagnosed with dementia or something like that would be probably best used. Use positive imagery. This is something I really find very interesting as well. Whenever we have an image of an older person or a flyer that has an older person, it's always wrinkly, very old, very frail, very hunched, very oldest old kind of looking, and that's not all older people though, right? We're cornering them and assuming this is how they all look, but they don't all look like that. So imagery is very important too, and I think connecting with older adults living in our community and bringing either courses to them, taking our courses to them, or inviting them to attend our courses as well. So this is really my final thought. I think we really need to promote lifelong learning, to help older adults stay active, to help our younger people have a positive or at least a more healthier image of aging, looking at intergenerational groups and how it actually reflects the diversity of our society, because we're not all young and we're not all very, very old. And of course, creating age-diverse environments actually teaches us to break out of these expectations and stereotypes and to be curious throughout our aging years and throughout our human lifespan, because I do believe that curiosity is actually ageless. So that is me. Thank you very much.